welcome to the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas training webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to give you a little bit of background on the project, give you some how-tos on how to participate, and generally orient you for the 2024 season. If you were active in our 2023 season, much of this will be old news, but please stay tuned because some of the things are different. Some of our goals are a little more focused, so just to stay up to date, it's worth reviewing. Rich introduced the Xerces Society a little bit, but just in case you're not familiar, we're named after a now extinct blue butterfly, and we work to protect invertebrates and the habitats that support them. And we do this a number of different ways, both through applied science and community science, like the Bumblebee Atlas. Also, where applicable, we do it through policy and advocacy directly through legislation and advocating for invertebrates in the halls of legislation. We do it through education and training and outreach to professionals or people working in conservation, or anyone who is interested in understanding more about the lives and conservation of invertebrates. And we also do it through on-the-ground conservation, so generating and protecting habitat for invertebrates. So I will just mention that we are a member-supported organization, and anyone is welcome to become a member, and the details are here. So this is a little outline of how our session is going to work for the next 2 hours. We're going to have a brief introduction to bumblebee biology, their ecology and conservation. If you attended the webinar on Saturday on bumblebee ecology and conservation, this will be kind of an overview, very, very quick version of that. If you would like a really in-depth dive into bumblebee biology, I recommend checking out our recording of the Bumblebee Ecology and Conservation webinar that we held on Saturday. The bulk of our time will be spent on how to participate in the Bumblebee Atlas. We'll take a wee break, and then we will spend 20 minutes just doing some really shallow dipping our toes into bumblebee identification in the Southeast, and then hopefully at the end we'll have time to address some questions. So just a little bit of an introduction to insects, and I'm sure this is preaching to the choir. If you are joining this webinar, you are probably very much invested in insect and insect life, but worth noting that there are at least 1 million described insect species in the world. I say at least, there might be upwards of 10 million, but in terms of described species, there are 1 million, which is about 2/3 of all animal species. A vast amount of diversity is contained in insect life. And why would we care about insects? Well, insects form the base of a lot of different essential ecological functions in our world, including decomposition, biocontrol. They're the base of the food chain for many creatures, from everything from other insects up to fish, up to bears, up to people. And then particularly relevant for our time today is pollination. So insects do a lot of work actually pollinating the plants that produce seeds, fruits, continue other plants that keep our world running. And a little bit more about what pollination actually is, I like to get technical about it, is the transfer of pollen from the male part of the plant, or the anther, to the female part of the plant, or the stigma. So any animal that does this could be considered a pollinator, and pollinators are extremely diverse. It includes your classic bees, but also butterflies, moths, wasps, flies, beetles, and then beyond insects, we even have invertebrates, or vertebrates rather, that are possible pollinators, including birds, monkeys, and then recently there was a study that suggested there's a particular frog that plays a role in pollinating a certain flower, which is very cute if you want to look up pictures of that. All in all, more than 85% of flowering plant species require an animal for pollination. And that animal is usually an insect, and oftentimes it is a bee. The reason that bees are, so ubiquitous as pollinators is that they are flower experts. They're evolved specialists to feed on flowers. They are the only pollinators that consume pollen and nectar as both larvae and adults, making them especially effective at getting pollen from point A to point B. Something that might have gone under the radar for certain people because the honeybee is probably our most familiar bee, but bees are extremely diverse worldwide. There are over 20,000 species, and this slide is just to give you an impression of the vast diversity of how bees look. In North America alone, we have 5,200 species, and then in the Southeast US, we have over 500 species of bee. Getting into bumblebees specifically, there are about 260 bumblebee species globally, with approximately 50, maybe at least 46 in North America, and about 17 in the Southeast. And this map on the left is giving you an idea of where bumblebees are most diverse in the world. It's thought that they originated in the Himalayas, so you see that red patch over in Southern Asia, where there's a high diversity of bumblebee species. So they seem to like it. They seem to like it where they love montane and temperate regions. So why would we be focused on bumblebees specifically? There are a few things that make bumblebees, even amongst bees, especially good and efficient pollinators. And I will go through some of those reasons here, but includes their physiology, the diversity of their tongue lengths, and also their sheer size and strength. They're big and bumbly. So when I am referring to physiology, specifically what I mean is their ability to engage in what is called muscular thermogenesis. So bumblebees can actually generate body heat by shivering their wing muscles, allowing them to fly in cooler temperatures. So that means relative to a lot of other pollinators, bumblebees can be active early in the day or later in the day in cooler or wetter temperatures, and at higher elevations or higher latitudes compared to other pollinators. So if you imagine that you're a plant that's growing in a relatively cool environment, or your flowers are active during an early or late part of the day, having a bumblebee available as a pollinator is really beneficial to you. Another thing that makes bumblebees such valuable pollinators is their variable tongue length. Bumblebee tongue lengths vary from short to long within and between species, and that this allows them to be generalists, which means as a group, bumblebees can access nectar and feed from a wide variety of flower species. And those tongue lengths that differ between species somewhat shapes their flower preference and their efficiency to forage on certain flowers. So as a group, bumblebees are pollinating a lot of different flowering species, and those variable tongue lengths are shaping which species they can feed from, or which species they can effectively feed from, as part of their efficiency as pollinators. Another thing that makes bumblebees extremely valuable as pollinators is literally their size and strength. One thing that bumblebees are capable of is what we call buzz pollination. So buzz pollination is where a bee grabs that male part of the flower, the anther, and vibrates to essentially vibrate it like a maraca. You might hear my dog coughing in the background, sorry about that. But they grab the anther and they vibrate their body to dislodge more pollen than would otherwise be dislodged. This technique is really efficient for pollinating certain flowers, including ones that we depend on in agriculture, like tomatoes, peppers, blueberries, cranberries. Bees that are capable of buzz pollination are really effective, and actually commercial bumblebees get used to pollinate certain ones of these, especially greenhouse tomatoes. Bumblebees, I think, are also valuable. This is not related to their pollination efficiency necessarily, except we do have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of active research about their ability to recognize and learn different flowers. But something that's interesting about bumblebees is that they've been shown that they can teach us about animal cognition. So we know that bumblebees can learn certain things quicker from observing peers. And this study in 2022 provided evidence that bumblebees even play. So given the opportunity between an arena with no balls and an arena without balls, bumblebees seem to take the opportunity to play with balls, seemingly for no other reason than to have a good time, which leads us to more questions about how animals learn, how they play, things like that. So really interesting animals. I'm going to really briefly touch on what a bumblebee's life and life cycle looks like, just so you get an idea. So most species of bumblebee live in social colonies that are founded by a single queen. And I say most species, I'll get back to that later. So these are colonies of about 25 to sometimes over 1,000 workers living together. And these colonies last only one season. So if you think of like an annual plant, it's sort of a similar deal with bumblebees. They last for just the one season. And these bumblebees nest in a variety of places, abandoned rodent burrows, bunchy grasses, kind of at the surface level of bunchy grasses, tufty, messy, unmowed areas, rock walls. People find them in bird boxes to their chagrin. They love messy, tucked away areas. I love this video from NC State Extension agent Debbie Roos from a colony that was living in the insulation of someone's house. They don't normally, and I wouldn't recommend bumblebees to be living in insulation, but that's just to explain the pink fluffiness. But I wanted to give you an idea of what the inside of a bumblebee nest looks like. It's quite messy and disorganized compared to what we think of, say, for a honeybee nest. But it includes clumps with the pupae and clumps with the larvae, and also waxen pots where they store nectar and pollen to provision the colony with. And that big lady in the top right is the queen. So each colony has a single queen and then 25 to over 1,000 workers, as I mentioned. The life cycle of a bumblebee, as I mentioned, lasts for a single year, and it's a pretty predictable life cycle. We start in the spring, and each spring the queen emerges. She's a queen from last year, and perhaps you've already been seeing huge bumblebees buzzing around, searching around on the forest floor. I saw some this weekend. This queen then searches for a nest location and starts provisioning pollen for herself and also to start her new nest. So she will create a clump of pollen and nectar, and on this clump she will lay her first batch of eggs. And then eventually this first batch of eggs will grow up, develop into adult bumblebees, and they will take over the tasks of provisioning, foraging, minding the nest, while the queen switches her focus to producing more young. And then the colony will peak in size in sort of the middle of the season, kind of midsummer. And then as we get into late summer, fall, this colony will start to produce reproductive individuals, so males and new queens, which will then mate outside of the nest. This example you see here is the rusty patch bumblebee, and you can see there can be a huge size difference between the male there on the left and the female, the queen, on the right. And then as the season progresses and we get into fall, winter, the colony from that year will actually die out, and those newly mated queens will nest or hibernate underground, overwinter in the ground, and they will emerge next spring. So the only one that makes it over to the next season are those newly mated queens. Earlier, I mentioned that most bumblebee species do it this way, and there are some usurpers in the case of cuckoo bumblebees. So for cuckoo bumblebees, they don't have that queen male female, they only have queens and males. And the cuckoo queen invades the nest of regular bumblebees, kills or subdues the original queen of that nest, and then essentially forces that nest's workers to look after and raise her offspring. I think cuckoo bees are really interesting and fun, and one interesting thing about them is that they often have sort of a thick build and strong stingers to help them with this practice of subduing. And something that I like about them is they often have these really thick heads, which presumably helps them in their task of subduing a nest, but also makes them a little easier to ID from regular bumblebees in the field. So I talked a lot about what we know about bumblebees, but there are tons of uncertainties, and that's where a project like this comes into play. We don't know where a lot of our species are struggling, where they're thriving, what factors play a part in where species are struggling or thriving, what habitat requirements do these different species enjoy and thrive in, what do these queens and males, where are they going, what are they doing when they're outside of the nest, what's happening inside of the nest, how is, what are the trade-offs when reproduction is happening, and a lot of unknowns concerning the ecology of male bumblebees. And something not mentioned here is also, we don't know a lot about where queens overwinter, where they prefer to overwinter, how many survive overwintering. So there's a lot of unknowns here. Which leads us to, why are we doing a bumblebee atlas? So many of our bumblebee species are in decline. So I mentioned we have something about 50 bumblebee species in North America. An IUCN work group assessed the conservation status of bumblebees globally and found that about a quarter of all our North American bumblebee species are in a near threatened or threatened category. So either critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. Which is a quarter of our species. If you look up in that little pie chart in the top left, which I'm referring to, there's also a chunk of the pie, which is that kind of bluish purple, which is data deficient. I think that's 5 species. So if you think about that, a chunk of our species don't have enough data to actually make an assessment as to how they're doing, which is a good chunk of our species. So why are bumblebees declining? There are a few different potential culprits. There's no one specific smoking gun, and this is the case for insects at large, really. For bumblebees, our major culprits are climate change, pathogens often spread from between bees from visiting flowers, pesticide exposure, and also habitat loss in the form of loss to agriculture and residential areas and commercial land. So we know that bumblebees are declining, but we're lacking the baseline data to make assessments about where they're declining, where they're not declining, what a healthy population looks like. And if we can't detect these declines or these recoveries, we can't detect these without a baseline, and we can't make effective conservation decisions about how to protect these species. The Bumblebee Atlas is part of the southeastern one, is part of a regional project or a nationwide project of bumblebee atlases that have been launching since 2018. So Rich mentioned that Xerces is headquartered in Portland, Oregon. So we started with a Pacific Northwest launch in 2018, and we've been growing steadily since then. And every time a new project launches, we get a surge of additional bumblebee observations from community scientists like you. And these observations go a long way to making applied tools for how to better conserve bumblebees, including guides to bumblebees of certain areas, what habitat management these species need. The bottom right shows data collected from the Pacific Northwest Atlas as to when these bumblebee species appear, what elevations they prefer, what plant species they prefer. And this is all information that can go a long way to figuring out how to best protect bumblebees. We've only had a year so far of the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas. We launched in 2023, but we're already making some interesting forays into what plants these species are foraging on. So one of the popular native species that was popular with the American bumblebee which is IUCN vulnerable, was Dasostoma macrophylla. And then with the Southern Plains bumblebee, their most popular plant was sweet pepperbush Clethra alnifolia, which is really common on the coast. So these are two species of conservation concern. We're starting to get a better picture of what plant species they enjoy foraging on. Okay, so that was a whirlwind introduction to bumblebee biology and their conservation. Now we're going to spend the next approximately 60 minutes talking about what the atlas is and how you can participate. So I mentioned that the Bumblebee Atlas project is it's a nationwide project, and we've been growing. We're in 20 states now, and we're technically coast to coast. We're kind of holding hands in Tennessee and Missouri there. And we're a collaboration with many different agencies in order to collect bumblebee data. And so for the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas specifically, we collaborate with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then this year we're supported by Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. And if we take a look at what we currently know about southeastern bumblebees, we do have quite a bit of sightings, but you may notice that they are very much clumped. So if you were to sort of backwards calculate where you thought bumblebees enjoyed living in the Southeast, you might conclude that they love living along I-85 on that route between Atlanta and Charlotte. Or maybe they love specifically the Blue Ridge Parkway, that's that U going through the mountains, or they love Nashville and Memphis. So our historical bumblebee survey efforts have been really concentrated in population centers where people are, which doesn't really paint a full picture of what's happening with bumblebees across the region. And there are areas where there haven't been observations since 2003, sort of deserts of information where we don't have a full picture of what's happening with our native bumblebees. And just to show you sort of what bumblebees we're dealing with here, we have maybe 15 to 18 bumblebees in the Southeast, depending on which historical species you are considering still living here. Of those approximately 17 species, 6 are considered threatened or near threatened in some way under the IUCN criteria. So that's something like a third of our native species are facing some degree of extinction risk. And we don't have a lot of information about these species. We know they're declining, but we don't have a lot of specifics as to where and why and what we can do to protect them. So this is a little bit of overview about the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas, how you can help collect data for this effort and help support these bumblebees. So the major beats of participating in the Bumblebee Atlas are, 1, to get trained, which if you're watching this video, you're doing that as we speak, whether you're watching this later recorded or you're joining live. 2, we ask that you create a Bumblebee Watch account. Bumblebee Watch is the name of the website where we submit and host our data. 3, adopt a grid cell, and I'll get to what that means in a second. 4, plan your survey. 5, within that grid cell you've adopted, survey at least 2 times within the field season. For us this year, that's between May 1st and September 30th. And then number 6, upload your data to Bumblebee Watch. So I'm going to go through each of those steps in detail. So training, it might be a moot point for the people that are watching this live, but there are a few ways to get trained. 1 is to view this training webinar either live or remotely. And option 2 is to attend an in-person workshop. So the in-person workshop covers much of the same things we cover in the training, with a little bit of a hands-on component at certain points. So we have 4 in-person workshops coming up this year, 1 this weekend in Tennessee, then the following weekend in Georgia, then the following weekend in South Carolina, and then 2 weekends later in mid-May, 1 at App State University. if you say have only just gotten the webinar version of the training and you want to get more hands-on experience, we will have 2 field events per state coming up this year. So I've listed 5 of them here that we've got coming up. 2 in Tennessee, 2 in South Carolina, and 1 in Georgia. And I link down there just to demonstrate that we keep our events page updated. You can register for these events on our events page. Keep an eye out for future events that get posted. These events are really fun. It's usually a smaller group. We go to some cool place and just spend our time catching, surveying, and IDing bumblebees. I think it's a good time. And if you want to get more confidence swinging a net, they're a really good opportunity to learn more. So that's training. Next is to set up your Bumblebee Watch account. If you are a returning user of the Bumblebee Atlas, or returning participant, one thing you'll notice when you visit Bumblebee Watch is that we have updated our website to be a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more user-friendly. So if you're new to the site and you click in the top right, you can either register or sign in. If you are signing in and you're a returning user, you will need to update your password if you haven't used it since the old site. But we hope that this new website is a little bit of a more user-friendly experience than the old Bumblebee Watch. And when you register for the project, you'll be prompted to indicate which project you're actually signing up for. You're going to indicate that you're signing up for the Bumblebee Atlas, and then you'll hit register. A fun aspect of the Bumblebee Watch is that it gives you a chance to track your sort of lineup of which species you've seen. So this is my lineup of verified species that I've surveyed and submitted to the Bumblebee Atlas. You can keep track of what checklists you've done, how many surveys you've done, and what photos you've submitted. And you'll be able to see when your photos get verified by our internal experts as to their species. So if you're a little bit competitive like me, it's just fun to try to collect as many species as you can. So that's joining Bumblebee Watch. The next thing I will discuss is adopting a grid cell. So when I say a grid cell, we've divided the Southeast states up into 276 grid cells. They're about 50 by 50 kilometers, but there's some weird ones in southern Tennessee and western Georgia. That's neither here nor there. We ask that our participants adopt a grid cell and then commit to surveying within their grid cell at least 2 times. You don't survey the whole grid cell, you just survey within your grid cell. A certain subset of our grid cells we've designated to be high priority. And there's a few reasons we make a grid cell high priority. One reason a grid cell might be high priority is because it has a high proportion of historical rare species. This is especially true of that clump of grid cells that are in the mountains. A lot of our rare species occur in the mountains, which makes that a really high priority region for us to get more data. Another reason a grid cell might be considered high priority is because it has had historically low survey effort. So if there hasn't been a lot of surveys in the past, that makes it a high priority for getting more data from in the future. So for us, that means Western Tennessee and Southeastern Georgia and Southeastern South Carolina, essentially the intercoastal plain and West Tennessee. So if you are going to adopt a grid cell, by all means, choose whatever grid cell is most fun for you or makes sense for you. If you feel willing to go the extra mile, so to speak, consider adopting one of our high priority grid cells. It really goes a long way towards making sure that we're getting the data that we need for these rare species. I'm actually going to now just show you our new site. Apologies, the window is being covered by my speaker information. Okay. So you should be able to see the new Bumblebee Atlas website that we now have. So if you want to explore your options for different Atlas grid cells, you're going to hover over Get Involved and you're going to click Adopt a Grid Cell. And if you scroll down on this page, shortly, there it is. We have an interactive map where you can actually take a look at the grid cells that we have. Proceed. And all the information that you will hopefully need to make your decision. So here from this map, if you click the bookmark of the Southeast, it'll zoom in on our partner states here, and you'll notice that our high priority cells start to light up. So all the red ones are our high priority cells. If you zoom in a little more, some more information becomes apparent. So you'll start to see the actual names of the cells themselves. We also have a layer here which refers to public lands where we have an existing permitting system. So if you're trying to make a decision about whether to survey in a grid cell, if there's one of these bright pink polygons in that grid cell, it's a potential option for a site where you could do a survey and where the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas has a streamlined permitting option that you could take advantage of. You can also, if you want to see for a specific address or a specific place, you can type it into here and it'll take you there and you can see which grid cell that your address lands in. And one more feature that I'll point out here is that if you click on this, what looks like a stack of papers here, layers, and then you open up the sublayers that are available for the Southeast, you can actually play a little bit with some of the information that we have here. And what I'll point you to specifically is that if you view the number of adopters cell or layer, you can actually see which grid cells have been adopted so far. So anything that's the lightest pink here has not been adopted yet. Anything that's this shade has 1 adopter. These two have 2 adopters. And we are capping it this year at 5 adopters per grid cell just to encourage people to spread out. So if you're interested in seeing, if you're interested in a grid cell and you want to know how many people have adopted it so far, you can check that out and you can actually click on it and see number of adopters here, 1 adopter for this grid cell. Okay. Now I'm gonna head on back to the PowerPoint. I'll get there eventually. Okay. Another thing I should point out is, that I should have pointed out on that page is after you have decided what grid cell you would like to adopt, when you scroll down on that page, there is a form for adopting your grid cell. On our new Bumblebee Atlas website, you will actually be asked to sign into the website to view that form. And you can do that a number of different ways. You can either create a new account or you can use an existing account like a Google, a Facebook, a GitHub, or an Apple account to sign in and view that form to adopt your grid cell. And that's what the grid cell adoption form looks like. You just enter some basic information and select which grid cell you'd like. So as you're making a decision about where you're actually going to survey, it's very flexible. Anywhere with abundant native flowers in bloom, ideally native flowers in bloom rather than sort of a cultivated garden, is perfect for participating in the Atlas. So that includes natural areas, urban areas that have available flowers, right-of-ways, and just a reminder to wherever you survey to follow the posted rules and regulations for that site. And where can you survey? You know that you need somewhere with flowers, but what are the kinds of lands where you could survey? This could be your land, if it's at least a hectare in size. It could be a friend or family member's land. It could be public roadsides. It could be a local park. It could be public land in the form of state or federal lands. And certain state and federal lands, we have a semi-automated permitting system that you can access to actually get the required permits for those sites. Essentially anywhere where you have express permission from the landowner, preferably written, and which has at least 1 hectare of habitat is ideal for this project. So I mentioned a little bit about permitting. Most public lands in the Southeast will require you to have permits on your person and will require you to notify the land managers, usually at least 48 hours before your visit. Note that your grid cell can include both public and private land, and to just please take precautions to not trespass on private land. So that means when you're out at a site, looking out for markers of private land. If you are asked to leave by some property owner, even if you're in the right, even if you're in the middle of a survey, please leave immediately. And for your own protection from trespass claims, we do encourage that any permission should be written. So we have, as I mentioned, certain areas where permitting is streamlined for the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas. So places where we have an existing dialogue with these areas and we can connect you with the necessary information. So it's quite broad. So it includes Georgia wildlife management areas and state parks, North Carolina game lands and state parks, and also the Smoky Mountains with a little bit of additional information, South Carolina state parks and Congaree, and then a bunch of places in Tennessee, wildlife management areas, state forests, state parks, and certain national wildlife refuges. Note that for North Carolina state parks, we are asking that you submit a permitting form by May 30th. They want to list the names ahead of time. And that permitting form will be available by May 1st, and I will notify folks via the listserv when that permitting form is available. This is just to give you an idea of what the permitting form looks like. This will be available on the website under our permitting info. If you have an idea of what site you want to visit, you can visit this permitting form, select your site, and it will automatically connect you with the necessary information, whether that's who to contact next, or the permit itself, or it will add you to a waiting list of to get that permitting info. It's a little different for every site, which makes it a little bit complicated, but we're going to do our best to help you get the permitting you need. If you don't see your prospective site type listed either on this form or on that previous page, you may need to acquire permission independently. I find that land managers are usually thrilled to have someone collecting some data, especially a sort of non-lethal catch and release project like this one, and they're usually very happy to help. And if you're not sure what permits you need, don't hesitate to shoot me a message. My email is there. It's also on the website. Shoot me a message and we'll figure it out together. So let's get into what a survey actually looks like. We have 2 main kinds of surveys, and one of them is what we consider sort of our gold standard, our sort of default preferred type, and that's our point survey. And then we have sort of an alternative option if a point survey is not feasible, and that's our roadside surveys. So for a point survey, you need to select an area that's at least 1 hectare in size. And a hectare, apologies, it's my dog. A hectare is 2.5 acres. And if you're trying to visualize what 1 hectare looks like, if you think of an outdoor track, it's the grassy area on the inside of an outdoor track. It's also equivalent to maybe roughly 2 soccer fields or 1.5 football fields. So you're going to select an area of that size. And you are going to survey in that area for 45 person minutes. And when I say person minutes, I mean if you have 3 people and you're all surveying, then you would survey for 15 minutes per person. If you have 2 people, you can look for bumblebees for 22.5 minutes per person. Basically, add it all together and you'll get the total amount of person minutes. So for 45 person minutes, you're going to search your site and you're going to catch every bumblebee that you can. You might not get them all, especially at first, but make your best effort to catch every bumblebee you see. A roadside survey is if you don't have the option to do a point survey. You can also do the roadside version, which is where you choose a stretch of road that's at least 10 miles in length, and you're going to do 5 mini surveys along that route. And each of these mini surveys should be at least half a mile as the crow flies from section to section. At each of these sections, you're going to spend 15 person minutes searching for bumblebees. Same sort of deal. It's like a point survey, but in 5 mini chunks. And for roadside surveys, there's obviously extra safety precautions, making sure to park out of the way of traffic and preferably wearing safety vests or bright colors just so that traffic is aware of what you're up to. For both of these survey types, you are going to complete a habitat assessment. So when you're done with your bumblebee survey, collecting and documenting which bumblebees you got, you're going to spend roughly 5 to 20 minutes collecting information about the type of habitat you're in. Is it a grassland or a farm? Is it forested? How many plant species can you see? How much of the area is in bloom, providing foraging resources for bumblebees? Is there any management occurring on the area, like mowing or pesticides? It's not particularly exhaustive. It's not very detailed information, but it gives us an idea of what kind of habitat these bumblebees that you found are living in, and potentially whether they're thriving or struggling, depending on what they're encountering in that habitat. If you find that you are not able to commit to the point survey or the roadside survey, or alternatively, you've caught the bug, so to speak, for looking at bumblebees and submitting photos of them, I'll mention that we also have an incidental observation version of this. So basically, if you're anywhere, any place, you see a bumblebee on a flower somewhere, you can snap a picture of it and submit it to Bumblebee Watch. But please do note that this doesn't count to your minimum requirement of 2 surveys, but it is interesting and valuable information. So just so you're aware. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the steps of conducting a survey, from planning it to how to collect the data, to photographing your bees, and then uploading that data to Bumblebee Watch. So our survey window this year is between May 1st and September 30th. And the purpose of that window is to capture sort of the peak of when bumblebee workers are active and capture sort of the maximum diversity of bumblebee species. So we ask that you do 2 surveys within your grid cell within that window. Optimal conditions are, thankfully, for people surveying pollinators, pollinators tend to like to be out when people like to be out. So temperatures between 60 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's midday and super, super hot, the bumblebees might not be terribly active. They might have hunkered down a little bit. So no need to go out in 102-degree weather and get heat stroke. 60 to 90 degrees is perfect. Minimal wind, ideally, and then not overcast, no rain. These are what make up good conditions for surveying bumblebees. There are a few materials that are required for participating in the atlas. A really key one is an insect net. We also ask that you have 10 to 25 collection vials or jars. And this is really flexible as long as it seals and can safely contain a bumblebee. A lot of different things work. People use baby food jars. Some craft stores sell little jars that get used for storing sequins and other craft supplies. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a a centrifuge tube like you see here. Just any sealable vial or jar works. You'll need something to take pictures with, whether that's a camera or a smartphone. You'll need a cooler or one of those portable insulated lunch boxes. When it comes time to survey, you'll need ice, some writing utensils, a stopwatch or timer. I just use my smartphone. You'll need those permits that you acquired, transportation to and from the site, and then please, because you're a human being, you'll also need to be mindful of water and sun and heat protection. Some extras that might be useful if you have them include a clipboard if you don't want your papers to fly away in a slight breeze. If you have a GPS device, that's always useful. I rarely use mine, but it's nice to have handy if you have one. Field guides, if you're really actively trying to learn your plant and bumblebee species, are always nice to have on hand. And then a safety vest, especially if you're doing a roadside survey, especially if you're surveying on a game land or somewhere where hunters might be active, a safety vest is pretty essential to have in your toolkit. And there's a link at the top there on our website, and it's mostly just to let you know that we have lists of suggested links for certain equipment on our page under our resources. So if you're exploring options for what kind of equipment you need to acquire, we have some options there. I'll also mention that at all the in-person events, the workshops and the field events that we have coming up, I will have nets and vials with me for people to take away if they need them. So if you're looking to get your hands on a net and there's a field event nearby, come on out. I'll give you a net. Some safety considerations before you set out, check those weather conditions. You know how a thunderstorm can roll in on a hot summer afternoon, that can happen. You might want to consider a few locations as a contingency plan. Always make sure that someone knows where you're heading, respect all local rules. And again, for game lands and roadside surveys, consider wearing bright colors, remain visible, and remain safe. So that's planning your survey. So let's get to the actual surveying part of your survey. So you've made it to your site. You will now fill out the top of your data sheet. So we have these data sheets available online for you to download. So when you get to your site, you're going to include the location and date, a little bit about you and how many observers are there, what kind of survey you're about to do, whether it's a point or a roadside. Also indicate whether you're going to capture all the bees or different bees or a combination of methods. We include this because sometimes when someone's a very experienced bumblebee surveyor, they might choose to only capture one of each species just to get the full diversity of species. But I recommend for most people, including myself, to capture all the bees because it's hard to ID on the wing what different species are. So you're going to circle all there. You're also going to include some basic temperature information, weather information, cloud cover, and wind speed, which I usually just check by looking at the info from the nearest weather station or the weather app on my phone, or cloud cover, I just look up. For the survey itself, this is the fun part. Remember that we are asking you to survey for at least 45 person minutes. So you're going to start your timer. You're going to note what time you started surveying. And then you are going to walk through your approximately 1 hectare and you're going to search flowering plants for bumblebees. And you're going to attempt to capture every bumblebee you see. You are then going to place that bumblebee in a vial. And you're going to place that vial on some ice to chill. We're also doing our best to record which flower species that these bumblebees are visiting on. So we ask that you keep track of which flower species each bumblebee came from. And the way I tend to do this is that I usually write a number on the vial lid, and then I take a photo of that bumblebee vial with the flower in the background so that when I'm going through my photos later, I know which flowers each bee is associated with. You're going to stop searching when you've reached your time, so 45 person minutes for a point survey or 15 for each bout of a roadside survey. And then the toughest part for me, and it's been the bane of my whole pollination biology career, is that those person minutes do not include the time that you spend handling the bee and putting it on ice. Those 45 person minutes are referring specifically to the time you spend searching. So whenever you are not actively searching for bees, when you're transferring that bee to a vial and putting that vial on ice, stop your timer. And then the toughest thing is to remember to restart your timer when you start searching again. That takes a little bit of practice. I still mess it up, but it is best practice to stop your timer when you are handling the bee. We have some videos on our training online page that I think are more effective than me talking at you about how to handle the net and best practices for catching a bee and transferring it to a vial. Some of it, it gets easier with practice. But as you're handling the net, some general tips to know is that when you have scooped a net over a bee or pretty much most insects, they tend to fly up. So if you have the net sort of mouth down on the bee, and then you pull up the mesh, the bee will fly up to the top of the mesh, and you can sort of isolate it at the end of your net. And then you don't have to touch the bee to get it into the vial. If you just slide the vial up into the net and over the bee, and then you can slide the vial cap into the net, put it between some net fabric, slide that fabric out, and then you've got your bee. And then watching out for her feet when you close the lid. People ask about stings, and that's a fair question. Stings are exceedingly rare, but they can happen, and it is a risk. So bumblebee females are capable of stinging, and especially if you're at a nest and disturbing a nest, they will defend their nest. Bees can be safely handled when after they've chilled on ice. But please note that if you are allergic, you know your own safety risks. Practice caution, carry an EpiPen, and look out for yourself. And again, if you want to see some hands-on sort of in the field demonstrations of swinging a net and transferring to a vial, visit that Train Online page, and there's some great videos there. This is just an example of tracking the host plant. They don't need to be beautiful pictures, as you can see here. They're really fuzzy. But I know that bumblebee number 1 I caught from some sort of wing stem, and bumblebee number 5 in the survey I caught from some sort of jewelweed. So when I'm going back through my bumblebee photos later, I can keep track of which flowers which bee was visiting. And something we get a lot of questions about is the fact that we put our bees on ice. And yep, we let our bees chill out. Chilling is a safe way to slow the movements of insects. It essentially anesthetizes them. It takes 10 to 20 minutes, sometimes fewer, to chill the bees so that their movements are slow enough to handle. And they can stay on that ice for up to 2 hours. And so once they've chilled, their movements are slow. You can manipulate them to take some really high quality voucher photographs. Make sure that your ice is not colder than 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And we include this because some freezers are mega coolers and cool to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, please avoid those like gel chiller packs that you use for lunch boxes or for injuries. Those sometimes cool bees to dangerously low levels. I find that usually store-bought ice is usually just right. Crushed ice is perfect. And there's minimal risk to the bees. When you have finished your 45 person minutes, record what time you ended, record how many person minutes you surveyed for. And now you are going to start photographing and recording the bees that you caught during your survey. Many people find the photography to be a difficult aspect, and we'll talk a little bit about tips for photography in a second. So in the bottom of the data sheet, you'll have this section for bumblebee observations. And as you are processing and photographing your bees, you can make your best guess as to what bumblebee species you're looking at, your best guess as to which host plant it was on, and then whatever way works best for you for tracking which photos on your phone or camera are associated with which bee. I've seen a number of different methods for how people keep track of which photos are associated with which bee. I do it by writing down the actual photo numbers from my camera or phone that are recorded in the system. Some people write a number in the background of the image. So say they're working on bee number 3, they have a 3 in the background. And so they know all the photos with a 3 in the background are associated with that bee. Whatever makes sense for you as you start surveying, you'll figure out which makes the most sense for you. So as you're taking photos of this bee, this is just a brief anatomy lesson for the kind of things that we're looking for in these photos. So if you are familiar with insect anatomy before, we've got 3 main segments. We've got the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The bumblebee, top of the bumblebee head is what we call the vertex. And then the bumblebee has 2 compound eyes and then 3 what we call ocelli, which are simple light collecting eyes in the middle of the forehead. Those are those 3 dots on the bumblebee's face. And then the thorax is where all the limbs are collected, 2 pairs of wings and 3 pairs of legs. On the hind leg, the backmost leg, female bumblebees will have what's called a pollen basket or a corbicula. It is a somewhat concave, shiny, hairless area where they actually store their pollen. And then the abdomen of female bumblebees has 6 segments, which we call tergites. And as you are learning how to ID different bumblebees, you'll start to hear bumblebee people shorten tergite to T. So T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6. And a shorthand you might hear is T1 yellow, T2 black. What we're referring to there is that that first segment closest to the thorax is yellow, and then the second one is black. The coloration of the abdomen segments is a really good first step for learning to ID your bees. So it helps to get familiar with that terminology. And so when you're photographing, a good rule of thumb is to make sure that you're getting 3 main photos. One should be of the bee's head, specifically the front of the face, and getting into that view a little bit of the hair on the top of the head, because the hair on the top of the head can be different colors for different species. And also the length of the cheek. So the cheek of a bumblebee is that space between the bottom of their eye and where their mandibles or mouth parts start. And some bumblebees have long cheeks and some have short cheeks. If you remember me talking about that variable tongue length between different species, that's reflected in the cheek length. So when I take a photo of the head, I usually take it from straight on, just like I'm taking that bee's LinkedIn profile photo. So I can see the length of that cheek. I can see a little bit of the top of the head. And I can see the face. The next photo you're going to want to take is one that shows the thorax being that middle part, that sort of torso of the bee. And you want to be able to see a little bit of the hair color in front of, between, and behind the wings. So in that photo in the top right corner, you can see this bee has kind of a band of black hairs between its wings. And we can also see in this photo the color of the hair on the underside of the wings. So we can see it's mostly yellow under the wings. So I like to choose a 3/4 angle for the side of the thorax, just so you can get a view of the colors of the hairs on the bumblebee's thorax. And then the final main photo that we're looking for is the abdomen. We would like to see the top and some of the side for all those different tergites, that T1 through T6, and what color is the entire tergite. So those are the 3 main photos we're looking for. I mentioned that photography is kind of the biggest hurdle for a lot of people, and I'm still learning how to get better. But if you want to check out on our Bumblebee Atlas page, we have a page for photography tips for ways on improving your photos. In a row at the top here, we just have some photos which are all beautiful in their own right, but are not quite what we're looking for. So top left is a beautiful photo, but the bee is partially obscured by the parts of the flower, so we can't quite see what's going on. The parts of the abdomen are mostly obscured. Bees 2 and 4 on that top, they're mostly silhouetted. We can't really see the colors of the hairs of the different parts. B3 is oriented such that we can only see a little bit of the thorax. So just making sure that your photos are focused and well lit. It helps to have them on a light colored background. That goes a long way to making sure that the photos are ideable. And to get that abdomen photo, to get all those different tergites or abdomen segments, it's okay to gently part the wings with your fingers in order to get a photo of all those different segments. Your bee will be anesthetized. You can just gently part them and get a good photo of that. When you're done photographing your bees, this is my favorite part to do with kids in the field, is if you put them in a warm, shady spot, after 5 minutes, she'll start to wake up, she'll start to buzz her wings, and then eventually she'll fly off. And I usually like to assign that task to someone in the group to be the bee minder, just to watch the bees warm up. They're usually fine. But very quickly after they're cold anesthetized, they'll wake up, they'll buzz around, and they'll resume their foraging business. So a summary of what the survey actually looks like: you're going to capture your bee using an insect net. You're going to put her into a clean vial. You're going to transfer that vial into a cooler. After 10 to 20 minutes, she will be cold anesthetized and slow enough that you can take photos of her safely. You're going to take those detailed voucher photos, that face, thorax, abdomen, and then you are going to release her, allow her to warm up within about 100 meters of where you captured her, so she's not too disoriented and she can get right back to it. When you're finished with processing, photographing, and releasing your bees, this is a good time to do the habitat assessment. So I talked about the habitat assessment as being quite a low-key course assessment of what's actually happening at the place that you're surveying. So you're going to make an assessment as to what the major habitat type is. We have some really general types here, whether it's grassland, woodland, shrub, agricultural, along a river, developed, or wetland. You're also going to make an assessment of the surrounding area as to what kind of habitat is around your survey site. And we include this because it's interesting to know in determining which habitats are good for which bees, whether your survey site is surrounded by parking lot or whether it's surrounded by more meadow. You're also going to estimate how much of your survey area has flowering resources available, how much of that surface area has something flowering there. Just to give you an idea, there are no flowers that we can see in this image on the left. This would be probably a 0% flowering resources, whereas this one is probably closer to 90%. Every part of this habitat, there's something growing there that's producing a flower. You're also going to note whether there is nesting habitat available. So we talked a little bit about how bumblebees love nesting in bunchy grasses and in rodent burrows and in messy old holes in the wall. So this is where you're going to note whether you noticed any of those things. And you don't have to go over your hectare with a fine-tooth brush. Just if you were out while you were out surveying, if you noticed any of these things, just make a note of it here. So whether there were brush piles or bare soil, rodent holes, rock piles, anything that could potentially be bee nesting habitat. You're also going to note, to the best of your ability, what kind of management occurs at your survey site. Do you see evidence of mowing? Is there livestock grazing? Do you know if pesticides are used at that site? Has it been burned recently? Is there a honeybee hive site nearby? You're going to indicate yes or no, or maybe suspect whether these are occurring at your site. And you don't have to know for sure, just make your best estimate as to whether these occur at your survey site. So this is just an example of what those bunchy grasses look like. And then on the right there, there's a brush pile. It's another potential habitat marker. And then the last thing you're going to do on your habitat assessment before you track your effort is indicate what plants and how many kinds of plants you saw at your site. So you're going to make an estimate as to how many different species of flower, including trees and shrubs, were in bloom in your survey area. And then you're going to list, to the best of your ability, which species, whether or not they were visited by a bumblebee, which species of flower occurred at your site. If you are new to identifying plant species, please don't be intimidated. We're all learning together. You can write, you can take a photo of anything you're not sure of. You can write it was tall and yellow and sunflower-like, and figure it out later when you're actually entering this data online. We ask that you eventually identify all these plant species down to genus, so not species level, just genus, to the best of your ability. And this gives us an idea of the diversity and availability of flowers that are available for these bees at each site. Finally, you're going to enter, because we love to keep track or know how much effort our volunteers are putting into it so we can properly thank you and note your efforts for our funders. What time you started and stopped on the day of the survey, how many miles you drove to do this survey, and how many hours did you spend organizing your photos and entering this data on Bumblebee Watch. Something I'll note also about surveying is if you are moving between sites, we ask that you sterilize your containers and nets in order to avoid spreading pathogens. And you can do this a number of different ways. You can use a really dilute bleach solution and soak your vials or your net in them and allow them to air dry. You can use an alcohol spray, or you can do it the way I generally do it, which is hot soapy water, a manual scrub, a really thorough rinse, and then air drying. Another point of safety for the bees is it gets hot in the Southeast. When they're in those vials, it gets pretty hot pretty quickly. So after you've captured a bee and put her in a vial, with some expediency, try to get her on ice because she can heat up pretty quickly in that vial, so less than 5 minutes. Also try to limit their time in the cooler. They can stay in there for quite a long time, but just to minimize risk, less than 2 hours is usually a good rule of thumb. And again, to minimize any disorientation she feels, release her within about 100 meters of where you captured her. Okay, so we've planned our survey, we've collected our data, and we photographed our bees. Now let's get to uploading our data. So we enter our data at bumblebeewatch.org. It's good practice to enter your data as soon as possible after you've collected that data. This is a lesson I've learned time and time again in science, is that if you go out and collect data and then you enter it on a computer later and there's something in your data that you have a question about or you don't quite remember what happened, it helps to have as minimal possible time, as little time between you entering that data and collecting that data as possible. Make sure that you're, again, keeping good records of which photos go with each bee. And it's useful before you start uploading your data to curate which are the best photos for each of the bees that you caught. On Bumblebee Watch, you can enter up to 5 photos for each bee, and I tend to recommend one of the face, one of the bee in profile showing the colors of the thorax, one of the abdomen showing all those segments, your best one of any of those at any angle, and then one of those, it's useful for it to be your photo of the vial with the host plant, because it's nice to verify when you're entering that host plant data that you can actually see that that's the host plant associated with that bee. And for more information, there's a page on how to submit data on the Bumblebee Atlas website if you get lost as you're submitting data, but I'll walk through it a little bit on this presentation. So you're logged into Bumblebee Watch. You're going to navigate to the homepage and click Add Bumblebee Sightings there in the top left. You are then going to be directed to this page where you can either submit to the general Bumblebee Watch, which are those incidental sightings, out and about, snapping a picture of a bumblebee on a flower. Or on the right, the Bumblebee Atlas. This is going to be for formal surveys like what we've been talking about. So click Submit Sightings on the Bumblebee Atlas and select Bumblebee Atlas under Projects. And then it's going to bring you to a page that essentially mirrors your data sheet exactly. And you are going to enter your survey location, where you did your survey, and you can do this a number of different ways. You can You can select choose from your locations. If you've done this before, you'll select a unique place name for each of your survey sites, and you can just keep choosing that name and it'll automatically populate these areas with the latitude and longitude. You can add a new location by searching for it and selecting it on the map. Or if you know the latitude and longitude of your site, you can just enter it directly there. But for each site that you enter, you're going to use your own unique survey name. It'll be added to your list of locations, and then you can select it when you do another survey. And then you're going to fill in the remaining form as it appears on your data sheet. So collection method, when you started, when you ended, temperature, cloud cover, any notes, the habitat type. It's essentially the same thing on the physical data sheet as you're going to enter online. And then this is somewhat new from last year, but it helps eliminate some of the confusion that we've gotten. If you go out to do a bumblebee survey and you don't see any bumblebees, but you still search, that's still valuable for us to know. We would love to know if you went out to an area, especially if there was plenty of habitat available and you didn't see any bees. So if you encountered bees during your survey, leave this box unchecked and hit submit, and it'll take you to the bee entry page. If you didn't encounter any bumblebees during your survey, hit this box, hit submit, and now your survey submitted. You submitted a null survey where you didn't see any bees, and that's still a valuable effort. And it counts towards your 1 survey or your 2 surveys that you can do within your grid cell. Then it's going to bring you to this page after you've done all the habitat data and sort of place setting. This is where you're going to record your bumblebee observations. So it's going to have this page where you can select photos, where you can select up to 5 photos for each bee. You're going to record your best guess of the bumblebee species and what sex it is. You don't have to be certain. You don't even have to make it a guess. You can say it's just a bumblebee or it's an undetermined species, and then it'll get submitted, and experts within the system, which will usually be me for the Southeast, will make a determination from your photos as to what bee species and sex it is. But if you want to practice, I think it's fun to make a guess. You also record any floral host information, so do your best to ID the genus, what flower this bee was visiting, and enter it as the floral host. And then record any additional notes if you would like to. Was this bee doing interesting behaviors? Was it, I don't know, emerging from a nest, mating with another bee? Any of those could be new information for whatever species that was, so could be potentially very valuable. And when you've finished entering all this information for a bee, you're going to click Add Sighting, and it is going to allow you to click New Sighting, and then you can enter another bumblebee observation. So you'll do this repeatedly for each of your bumblebee species or your bumblebee individuals. That was a lot for uploading data. Again, you can visit for how to submit data on our website if you would like another step-by-step, some step-by-step help on how to submit data. But we're going to move on to some FAQ. These are some questions that I get a lot, especially about the grid cells. Can you do more than 2 surveys? Yes, I very much welcome that. You can definitely do more than 2 surveys. 2 is our minimum. Can you survey with a group? Yes, we encourage folks to make it a social activity. It can be fun to do in a group. Sometimes people adopt a cell as part of a company or school or church group, and do it as a group. Just remember that when you're surveying, to add up your individual person minutes for an accurate measure of your effort. Do you survey at the same spot every time? I encourage people to, when they're surveying, to survey the same location, but spaced apart in time by a few weeks. Alternatively, you're not required to do that. You can also survey different sites. I would encourage folks, if you're going to survey different sites, to do 2 different sites on the same day, essentially keeping one of these factors the same, either the same spot separated by time, or different spots at the same time. But whatever feels flexible and good to you, those are just our golden standards for the project. Can more than one person adopt a grid cell? Yes. But if we do notice that lots of people are adopting the same grid cell, we will remove it as an option from the grid cell adoption page. I'm going to cap it at 5 this year, and this is just our way of helping spread out our efforts so we're not just reflecting those population centers like we have historically. Can you adopt more than one cell if you're a real overachiever? You definitely can. Some people do that, and they've caught the bug for catching bugs, and they adopt more than one cell, and that's great. But be sure that you're prepared to commit to those 2 surveys within your grid cells. Okay, I talked very fast with a lot of information for a very long time. We're going to take a 5-minute bio break, and we're going to return here at 7:26. So take this chance to get a drink of water, and I'll see you back here at 7:26. Okay, great. We will resume. All right, so the last part of me talking is going to be a little bit about Southeast bumblebee identification. And this is going to be really surface level. It's just to introduce you to identification and hopefully kickstart your journey into learning to identify bumblebees. So we're going to cover some really broad level identifications, but which are trickier than you might think. So determining whether you're looking at a bee versus a fly, whether you're looking at a bumblebee versus other bees, whether you have a male versus female bumblebee, which is going to be important for species level ID. Then we have some tips for how to ID a species, and then we're going to cover 3 of our sort of major players for southeastern species, plus 1 our federally endangered species. So here we go. It's going to be, I sort of think of it as kind of a family tree, or if you're familiar with a dichotomous key, starting with insects broadly and then narrowing it down to whether you have a bee or not a bee. And so that's what we're going to start with. Do you have a bee or not a bee? It is, again, harder than you might think. So we have 8 bees here, or we have 8 insects here rather. And I would love it if folks could guess which one they think is the bee. I actually have a poll here, so we're going to try to launch that. So hopefully you should see a poll pop up saying find the bumblebee, and you're going to enter which one you think is the bumblebee of the 8 insects on this page. And I'll give you like 20 seconds. Okay, pretty good. So we got most people saying it's the first one. We got a chunk of people saying it's F, and if you selected F, you are correct. It's F. So it's a little harder than you might think, and even hardened entomologists can make a mistake sometimes. So we're going to talk about some of the tips and tricks for knowing which is which. So some of the key characteristics are that bees have 2 sets of wings, or 4 wings total, so 2 on either side, while flies just have 2 wings. In fact, technically they have a set of true wings, and they have a set of sort of spoon-shaped reduced wings called halteres. On the bottom image, you can see behind that fly's wings, it has these 2 spoon-shaped structures. Those are the halteres. So the fly has 2 wings total, the bee has 4 wings total. Another way to tell them apart is the way they carry pollen. So bees usually have a specialized structure for carrying pollen, whether that's on the leg or on the other underside of the abdomen. As we talked about, they are specialized on flowers, so they're very good at storing and carrying pollen, whereas flies will tend to be carrying little to no pollen. They're important pollinators, but not necessarily they don't necessarily have that specialized structure for carrying pollen. Another way to tell the difference is the antennae. So bees have long antennae, while as flies, at least the flies that we tend to mix up with bumblebees, have short, stubby antennae. Um, and then another way to tell the difference, although sometimes it gets a little tricky, is the eyes. So bees tend to have separated eyes on either side of the head, whereas flies often have large bulging eyes near the front of the head. Sometimes it looks like the entire head is made up of eyes. So this isn't a poll. This is, you can type this in the chat or think this in your head. Is this a bee or a fly? So think your answer to yourself or type it in the chat. I'll give you like 5 seconds. This is a fly. This is a robber fly. And we can tell because even though it's tough, those wings are folded over, we can see that whole tear, that reduced spoon-shaped wing structure poking out there. The robber flies have a funny sort of mustache, which kind of obscures the way their eyes look, but they have these bulbous eyes at the front of their heads, and then they have stubby antennae. So this is a bumblebee mimic doing a really good job, but it is a robber fly. Okay, so we've talked about distinguishing not a bee from a bee. Let's talk about some common bees that we can mix up with bumblebees. So let us figure out how to tell a bumblebee from a honeybee. So honeybees tend to be smaller than bumblebees. They have a medium body with kind of an elegant torpedo-shaped abdomen. I think it's quite polite of honeybees to be somewhat honey-colored. They're kind of a rich black orange, they're kind of a rich orange-brown color like honey. Like bumblebees, they do have that pollen basket, so you might see honeybees carrying that thick lump of pollen on their hind legs. So that's something they do share with bumblebees. But something that they don't share, or something that bumblebees don't have that honeybees do, is honeybees have hairy eyes. So if you are really struggling to figure out if you have a honeybee or a bumblebee, lean in close. Honeybees actually have hair growing on their eyes. The thing that's usually tough for people is actually a bumblebee versus a carpenter bee. This is tough when you're first starting out identifying bees. Carpenter bees are in a different genus. They're separate entirely from bumblebees. And the main ways to tell if you have a carpenter bee, the big one for me is that they have a smooth, shiny, mostly hairless abdomen. It kind of shines like a big, I don't know, a stoplight when they're flying around compared to the fuzziness of a bumblebee. Another dead giveaway is males have these bright yellow faces. So if you see a bee buzzing around with a bright yellow face and it otherwise looks like a bumblebee, you are dealing with a male carpenter bee. Another key difference, which you might need to lean in a little further to see, is that bumblebees, at least the females, will have that shiny hairless pollen basket on their hind leg, that little triangle there. While as carpenter bees, their hind legs look more like a pipe cleaner, sort of uniformly fuzzy all around. That's a structure called a scopa, a hairy section where they store their pollen. Another way I determine bumblebees from carpenter bees is behavior. So sometimes I'll see a photo that someone sends in, and it's of a huge black dot flying next to someone's house, investigating the wood. That's probably a carpenter bee, maybe a male scoping out its territory. So if it's a big bumbling guy with a shiny, mostly hairless abdomen, haunting your wooden structures, it's probably likely to be a carpenter bee. So those are the major ones to just keep an eye out for, honeybees and carpenter bees. So let's say that you are pretty sure that you're dealing with a bumblebee. A next good step to know is whether you're looking at a male or a female bumblebee, because sometimes males and females in certain species look different. So it's helpful to know what you're looking at. So there are a few characteristics that help you determine if you're dealing with a male or a female. And during the time of year that we're surveying, it's mainly going to be females you're looking at, but we do come across males. So In general, females tend to look a little more well-groomed, like they comb their hair that morning compared to the males, which tend to be a little more unkempt in appearance, a little shaggier. Another difference is that females have that really clear pollen basket on the hind leg. The males don't collect pollen, so they have hair on that hind leg. It tends to be more concave, not so much a clear, or rather it'll be hairy and not hairless. It'll not be a pollen basket. Another difference is that pretty much on most dimensions, males are longer and sort of lankier than the females. They have an additional abdomen segment. We talked about that those tergites, or those T1 through T6. On the female, males have 7, so they have T1 through T7. Their abdomens are a little longer and lankier looking. Same with their antennae. This can be subtle unless you've looked at a lot of bee antennae, and maybe you will by the end of this year. But females have 12 antennal segments, whereas males have 13. Their antennae are a bit longer. Something that makes it tough when you're trying to figure out whether you're looking at a bee or a fly is that males of some species have really enlarged, bulged eyes. All the better for scoping out females, makes them look a little bit more like a fly. So that individual on the right has big bulging eyes, different from the female on the left. And then really key if you are surveying and handling bees is you might like to know that only the females have stingers and the males do not have stingers. This is true of all hymenopterans, which is the group that includes bees, wasps, ants. It's only the females that have the stinger. So if you are sure you have a male, you can impress your friends by holding him with abandon, plopping him on their laps with consideration for his and their safety. The males do not have a stinger. And you can also see in that picture on the bottom right that those bulging eyes of the male. When I've figured out if you have a male or a female, there are certain tips to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out which species you have. We talked a little bit about male versus female, but also there can be difference between queens and other females and other males. These different castes also have different periods of activity. So if you remember back to that life cycle we talked about, queens will be active early in the year, followed by the workers, and then late in the year, you'll start to see the males for a given species. Another thing that's important when you're figuring out what species you have is we talked a little bit about that cheek length in terms of taking photos. So that space between the bottom of the eye and the mouth parts is the cheek length. And that can be really key for distinguishing certain species. So just as an example, we have rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis on the left, has kind of a shorter heart-shaped face compared to the longer-faced yellow and black bumblebee on the right, Bombus oricomis. And this is just a really quick introduction to some of our major species. Just so you have an idea going in, some of our major players. And I would say if you're surveying in our region, maybe 60% of the bumblebees you're likely to see are going to be one of these 3 species: common eastern bumblebee, two-spotted bumblebee, or brown-belted bumblebee. So I'll really briefly go over the differences between these 3 species. So the common eastern bumblebee by itself was 60% of our observations for the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas in 2023. It has on its abdomen, remember that T1 through T6, that first abdomen segment, T1, is yellow, while T2 through T6 are black. And this is the case for males and queens, and makes it quite simple to distinguish to a degree. In the center of its back, it has kind of what we might call a cloudy yellow, a mix of yellow and black hairs forming a teardrop or a circle shape. They're super common. They're commercially reared and used in agriculture in some cases, like for those greenhouse tomatoes I mentioned. Super common. If you see a bumblebee in your back garden, the first question you should ask is it a common eastern? Another super common one we get is Bombus bimaculatus, the two-spotted bumblebee, maybe a runner-up by a good distance from common eastern. It has that T1, that first segment is yellow, and then for the females, that T2 will have kind of a W shape. which is where the two-spotted name comes from. So in the graphic and in the photo on the right, you can see that kind of B or W-shaped yellow patch on T2. You have a black circle in the center of their abdomen. Something to note, though, is that we talked about the fact that males and females look somewhat different. So male two-spotted bumblebees look very different from the female. This individual has T1 and T2 yellow, and then T3 mostly black, T4, T5 mostly yellow. So just something to keep in mind if you see someone who looks a little weird, maybe it's a male that you're looking at. Another major player for us is going to be the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus griseoculus. It has that, again, like the previous two, that T1, that first segment is yellow, but the T2, that second segment, usually, but not always, has a brown crescent of hair surrounded by black. That's where that brown belt comes in. Another way to tell the difference, because sometimes it doesn't have that brown belt, is they tend to have kind of a short-haired, neat buzz cut look. So if you're really struggling, a clue that you might be dealing with a griseoculus is if it has that short buzzed haircut. That's one clue you can work with. Another clue is that this is one of the species where the males have huge buggy eyes. So if it's got close cropped hair and huge buggy eyes, maybe you are handling a male Bombus griseoculus. And then this is one I want to have on your radar because it's such a valuable and essential one for our region. The rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, is our federally listed species. It hasn't been seen in this area since, and by in this area, I mean the Southeast. It hasn't been seen since 2011, I believe. And so the abdomen is, that first segment, again, is going to be yellow. And then in the workers, that second segment, that T2, is going to be yellow with a brown patch. So a brown patch otherwise surrounded by yellow. That's the rusty patch that it gets its name from. The queen, meanwhile, lacks that rusty patch, which makes it a little bit tough. Another way to tell you're dealing with a rusty patch bumblebee is in that top image for the worker, you can see there's kind of a thumbtack-shaped black dot on the thorax. That's another sign that you are seeing Bombus affinis. Again, we haven't seen it in this region since 2011, but it has been seen in Virginia since 2014. And we still have habitat that potentially is good for Bombus affinis. So there's a possibility we still have it in the Southeast. We just don't have people on the ground looking for it. So this is one to keep your eye out for. There are plenty of resources as you are learning how to ID bumblebees and other bees. Many of these are linked on the Bumblebee Atlas website under resources. There's also a steadily building sort of field guide on our resources page where you can look at profiles for different species. And if you're interested in understanding bees and bugs generally, some other good sources are Bug Guide. It's my go-to for if I see a bug I have no idea, then I'll walk through Bug Guide to figure it out. Discover Life is another good one. And then for folks, it's mostly applicable for North Carolina, but also I think it works for surrounding states. There's a free PDF online for the bees of North Carolina, which goes to genus level for a lot of our native bees. And with that, I would like to thank the Xerces Society supporters, and I would like to thank our collaborators and funders. And you'll notice that we have some social media handles down there at the bottom. We have a Facebook group, we have an Instagram, and we have a Twitter/X where you can get connected with our upcoming events and what we've got going on. And with that, I think I have left 15 minutes for questions. And I'm excited to see what's been going on in the Q&A and chat.
Yeah, Lori, that was great. Thank you. I think I've managed to keep up for the most part with folks' questions. There is a lingering questions here. You may have answered this, but someone wanted clarification. Do grid adoptions from last year carry over to this year, or do we start fresh?
Yeah, we start fresh. So if you adopted a grid cell in 2023, we ask that you submit an adoption form again in 2024. This helps keep track of which grid cells are on track to be surveyed in a given year.
That is the only open question lingering right now.
Okay.
If you did ask a question in the Q&A and it disappeared or something, there should be different tabs over there, including an answered tab, and you should be able to see the questions that I answered. And yeah, so feel free to check that out.
Awesome, will do. But barring any additional questions, yeah, I guess we covered it. If you do think of other questions, you can reach me at lori.heyman@xerces.org. I'll drop that in the chat real quick. Shoot me a question if it comes up, and I'll do my best to answer it. And otherwise, thank you everyone for joining on again this Tuesday evening. I hope you have a chance to eat dinner before or after this, and I really appreciate you joining. And this webinar again is recorded, and it'll be available on the Bumble Bee Atlas resources page, on Train Online page, and on the Xerces YouTube channel. Thanks again, and I
Hey,
hope
Lori.
yeah.
Another question just popped in here. Someone signed up for a grid cell tonight and they got the automated email, but it said the year was 2023. So she just was making sure that she sent the grid to the right place. We probably just need to update that.
Yeah,
that
we need to
information.
update that.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great question, Terry, and thanks for bringing it to our attention. You're signed up in the right place. We just need to update our confirmation email so that it reads the right year. So thank you. Great. Again, if you think of anything else, shoot me a message, and I really appreciate everyone joining, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks,
Thanks,
Rich. Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Bye.